fascinated by true crime, but for our next guest, dangerous criminals are just a normal part of his day job.
As a forensic psychiatrist, Dr Das has spent the last 12 years assessing and rehabilitating some of Britain's most notorious convicts.
And today he's joining us to reveal what life is really like behind bars. Good morning, Dr Das.
Morning.
I mean, as I said before, and we just spoke there in the break, that actually there's such a big appetite to know what happens. It's like this sort of other world. It's otherworldly, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose. Now, you've worked with some of Britain's most dangerous convicts. What does your role actually involve?
So, firstly, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
There's two different parts of my job when it comes to assessing people in prison. So the first part is working as an expert witness. So I'm really actually there just to assess them as a one-off briefly so I can give evidence in their criminal trial. So that's actually to help the judge and the jury. And the second part is actually working in prisons. So that's more of a role of a psychiatrist. So it's like running psychiatric clinics, looking after their general mental health care needs.
And so do you said you go into prisons and actually sit face-to-face with the criminals, is the right word?
Yeah, we'd call them offenders if they're...
Offenders,
very
yeah, no.
yeah, but...
So you sit face-to-face with offenders. Are you actually ever scared?
I've got to be perfectly honest with you, Andy. I'm not scared, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think my general... I've got a general slight lack of fear. Maybe I'm a tiny bit of a psychopath myself. But also...
Now he tells us.
But also because, generally speaking, they're on their best behaviour, because they know that I'm there for a purpose, which is to write a report that the judge will see. So it's in their best interest to come across a certain way. So they might be, you know, potentially aggressive, criminogenic, hostile or angry or bullying on the prison wings, but they're on their best behaviour for that 1 hour or so when I'm assessing them.
So do you think they almost look to you as a friend or as like a bit of a support whilst you're there?
If it's a one-off assessment, then not so much. But when I'm there as a psychiatrist, I've worked in a female prison as a psychiatrist on a regular basis for a couple of years, then absolutely. And sometimes these are people who are quite damaged. They come from a background of very little social support. Sometimes they have very lax or neglectful parents. So absolutely, I'm one of the key figures within the prison that shows them support and affection.
So is the prison system working for those who are clinically damaged, let's say? Is the prison system working for them, or is it the fact that someone like you comes in, identifies that actually there is something wrong with them, which might justify what they did?
So that is a difficult question to answer. I'd say that a huge proportion of prisoners have some sort of mental health issue, about three-quarters, and about two-thirds have a drug and alcohol issue. So I think that the prison system is trying its best to deal with those issues and to try and rehabilitate people to make them safe once they've left. But like many public services, it's massively overstretched. There's just not enough mental health care professionals in. The waiting list to see some quite ill people, you know, sometimes people that are hearing voices, that have paranoid delusions. Realistically, sometimes they're in that state for weeks until they get to see a psychiatrist and get the treatment that they need.
And, like, when we talk about rehabilitation, you know, when that comes to a prisoner, I suppose there's many layers to that. There's many steps. How does that first look?
So the first and foremost, you have to take each individual and figure out what are the risk factors that cause them to offend. So if it is a mental health issue, then in theory you can treat that, antidepressants, antipsychotics, the right medication. If it's a drug and alcohol issue, then you can also reduce that through specific rehabilitation. Then once you get past those key factors, you have to actually have tailored rehabilitation for that individual. So if it is domestic violence, if it's anger management issues, if it's because of their criminogenic peers like gang members, you have to take each of those risk factors and sit down with psychologists and really unpick those things and try and reduce them to make them safe once they're released.
Right.
What's the most shocking thing you've encountered or experienced?
Good question.
Because I watched that TV programme, Time, which I think you've said was quite realistic. There were some really shocking things in that for us as viewers, but you're doing it in everyday life.
Yeah. So there's one story that jumps to my mind immediately. I should probably give your viewers a trigger warning because it is pretty graphic. So the most shocking thing that I've seen in prison was a man who became psychotic and did some very extreme self-harm. So his offence wasn't that serious. He was actually in for arson, but the other prisoners immediately took a dislike to him and they started spreading these rumours about him being a child sex offender, which wasn't true. So he was getting threatened, bullied, harassed, even beaten up. So over the space of a few weeks, because of this stress, he became psychotic and he had these delusional beliefs that other prisoners wanted to kill him and take it and eat his eyeballs so that they would get superhuman power so they could escape. So he basically preemptively removed his own eyeballs. So one with a plastic knife and one with his own fingers.
Oh,
so, yeah,
my
that's something
goodness me.
It's always going to stay with me, I would say.
And you saw that?
I didn't see it happening, but I assessed him shortly afterwards in a civil case when he was trying to actually sue the mental health team in the prison.
And can you just, sorry, Rush, can you just explain psychotic? Yeah. What does it mean?
So the term psychosis, I think, is quite often misunderstood.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just think it's anybody who's...
People use it quite freely, don't they?
They do, yeah. They use it colloquially. So psychosis is a state outside of your normal baseline self.
Right.
So it's in theory temporary if you have the right medication. And the typical symptoms are hallucinations, so auditory hallucinations, hearing voices. Yeah. In the patient group that I see who are offenders, typically those voices command them to go and hurt other people or to hurt themselves. Or delusions, which are fixed, unshakable beliefs. And again, in the patients that I see, they tend to be paranoid delusions. So people believe that strangers, random people, are trying to attack them or want to hurt them. So sometimes they preemptively strike and act out violently.
Right. What do you think in your, in your history of working in the job that you do, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about life in prison?
Good question, Rochelle. I think a couple of things spring to mind. I think there's this public image that prison is really cushy and is really easygoing, and the prisoners have TVs in their cells and they have PlayStations. And some prisoners do get privileges if they don't break any boundaries or push the rules for many weeks in a row. But actually, it's quite a harsh life. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of gang beefs, drugs are rife in many prisons. And so I think that's one massive misconception. And I think another thing is that people assume that offenders, especially violent offenders, are beyond help. But as I said before, there's always reasons, there's always factors. And if you can remove some of those factors, and some of it might be through medication, some of it might be through therapy, then you can, I think, massively decrease the risk of individuals and make them safe to be released into society.
And as a doctor, that's your belief, isn't it? As a doctor, you want people to get better, and that's what you aim to do with every person you see?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I work as an expert witness, my role is to decide whether they've got mental illness or not, whether it's treatable or not, whether it drove their offending or not. And if they don't have a mental illness and if they are criminally responsible, then my role ends and they go to the criminal justice system. So there is a judge and a jury.
Right.
So as a doctor, I don't try and bring my own judgment into it. It's not about whether I think... Your
personal opinion, it's...
a medical diagnosis.
Yeah.
Look, we don't want to end with the image of the man who did that thing to his eyes. She's obsessed with this sort of stuff, literally off the scale. Yeah. So if you ever need anybody to run ideas by, she's your woman. She loves it.
I wouldn't know what to do, but I'm just
she loves
so
it. She's
interested.
obsessed.
It's like that otherworldly thing.
Would you be able to take her in with you one day?
What, into prison?
Yeah.
I can take you in, but I can't guarantee that you'll be able to leave.
Oh my gosh! OK. I'm now less obsessed.
Yeah, all of a sudden. Look, thank you so much.
Thank you so
really
much.
lovely to meet you.
Could talk to you all day. Fascinating.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.